everyone, welcome to Watercolour with Amy. I'm Amy and this video is part of the City of Melbourne's Makerspace series. Today is video 1 of 3 videos where we will be exploring beginners watercolour together. I would like to acknowledge the people of the Kulin Nations, the traditional custodians of this land. I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, on whose land we learn, create and play. Before we get started, there are a few basic materials that you will need. First of all, we're going to need some paint. Now, watercolour paint comes in tubes like this, or it can come in little blocks like this. It's the same paint, this is just dried versions of the tube. The dry versions are great because you have a little bit more control. So what I like to do when I have tubes of paint is just squirt some onto either a palette or I've got these little things, but it's basically the same thing, and let them dry overnight and then use them the next day. Watercolour is great for beginners because all you need to activate it is to add water. So what we're going to need is some water, and I've got 2 glasses or 2 jars of water here. One is to wash my paintbrush and the other is to add new water to my paintbrush. If you want a clean painting, you need to have clean water. The other thing we're going to need is paintbrushes. I have 3 different size paintbrushes here. I've got a big one, a medium and a small. 2 is generally fine, a nice big one for washes and a smaller one for sharper lines and details. Brushes come in all sorts of sizes and types. The 2 main types are hair brushes and synthetic brushes. I have hair brushes here. Some people don't like working with hair brushes because the hair can fall out in your work, but I've never had a problem. Basically, if you have a soft brush, it will be just fine. You will also need a cloth to wipe your paintbrushes, and I recommend having a tissue as well to help dab up extra water. Masking tape is also great to tape your paper down and create sharp edges and shapes. And lastly, paper. Now, paper is the most important bit. The rest you can get away with, whatever fits within your budget and your means. To have a play will be fantastic. But the one important thing is the paper. If you don't have good quality thick watercolour paper, then it simply just won't work. So I've got an example here. This is just a watercolour pad that I'm using today. It is 300 GSM, which relates to the thickness. You can get smooth or rough texture. It doesn't really matter as long as it's thick and absorbent watercolour paper. Here's a list of everything I've just mentioned to get us started. What we're going to do today is a technique called wet on dry. Basically what that is wet paint onto dry paper, and then we're going to use that technique to create a finished product. So what I'm doing now is I'm just adding some water straight to my watercolour paints and then onto my tray. And you might notice that my paint palette has paint all over it. I never wash my paint palette because every time you add water, it reinvigorates and makes the watercolour come alive again. Then I'm taking my wet paint and I'm going to paint it straight onto my dry paper. And that is essentially wet on dry. The more water I add, the lighter the paint will be. I've got one paint here. And essentially already about 3 different shades of blue. If I wanted a really dark one, I would add more blue. Like this. More water down here. And I'm just dragging that through like this. Another thing about watercolour is that you work from light to dark, which is really different from other mediums. So for example, oil paint or acrylic paint, you start with darker layers and work up, and then right at the very end you put your white on to find where the sun or where the light is coming from. It's the opposite with watercolour. So with watercolour, you need to know where your lightest points of the picture are and add darker and darker from there. So it takes a little bit more planning than other paints, but it's part of the really fantastic translucent quality of this type of painting. So the whites can be the very white of the paper, or you can block those out, but we'll explain that in another video. The way to get depth with watercolour is to overlay lots and lots of different layers, and you can do that with different colours or the same colour So we can add water to make it lighter, and we can either add more of the paint to make it darker, but also we want to layer those up, and we're going to practice doing that today. So when we start a picture, we need to think about where we want the lights to be and to start off very light. So we're going to practice that with a very light wash of this pink colour. And I'm just going to do a circle here and then essentially fill it in. You need to work quite quickly with watercolour, especially on a warm day. Okay, now I know how to do wet on dry. Let's make that translucent piece I was showing you before. What I'm going to do, this is my dirty water, and I'm going to pick up some clean water, is pick a colour. I do like that potter's pink. So I've made a very, very light wash to start with. This is our first layer, so we want it to be really, really light and translucent. I'm doing circles because I really like circles, and I think they look, when I do this piece, a little bit like bubbles, and I think that's cool. But you can pick any shape you like. You could do squares or triangles or blobs. It really doesn't matter. Another important thing to know with wet on dry technique is that as you're layering up the colours, it needs to dry really thoroughly between each layer. Otherwise the colours will bleed into each other, and then it becomes wet on wet, which is a different technique. I'm doing lots of different sized circles here. If you make a mistake and you don't like what you've done, you can erase it. I'm going to get my tissue here. I've added too much water and I've gone outside the shape that I want to make as a circle. So I'm just going to, whilst it's still wet, dab it up. This is all I want for my first layer. And now I'm going to wait for it to dry before I put on my next layer. For my next layer, I'm going to go a little bit darker. Clean my brush properly. And I've made sure it's very dry in between. So this time, I'm going to overlap some of my circles. I'm still quite light, but it's definitely a little bit darker, and you can see here the watercolour is doing what watercolour does best, which is be really translucent and beautiful. Now another trick that I'm going to do, because I don't want my dots to be too perfect. I don't want them to have a perfect wash that's the same across all of them. I'm going to dip my paintbrush into the water and just put a drop on my circle like this, and it gives it more of a tie-dyed look, or a bit more texture. I really like that. I don't like things looking too perfect. And I'm just going to continue on like this until I've got as many circles as I like. Again, I'm filling in my circle, and then I'm going to get a drop of clean water on my paint, and you can see the effects it's making. And you can see with wet on dry that I can get quite a sharp edge. One mistake I have made here is I haven't got quite enough paint to finish what I'm doing. It's always a good idea when you are doing a finished product with watercolour that you really think about how much paint you might need. There you go. I'll mix up some more. Okay, to speed things up for this video, I am going to dry this layer, but I'm going to be really careful that I don't dry it too close, or I'll create a splatter painting, and that's not what we want to do. have noticed as it started to dry that I'm getting a really sharp line of paint around the edges of my circle. And the reason that's happened is because I've added lots of clean drops of water to get that really tie-dyed look. I really like that. I wanted them to look almost like little planets, so I've left that go. But if you didn't want that, just don't add the drops of water and you'll have a much more even circle. Okay, on with the next layer. So I'm going to go a little bit darker again because remember we're starting from light and building up to darker layers. I've chosen a blue. But if I wanted that tie-dyed look, that's when I would dip my water in and add a drop. For some of these I might put a little bit more flat washes to show you the difference. I've made this one a lighter blue just by adding more water, just to show you the difference. So you can see that I'm overlapping my previous circles, and it will feel like as you're doing it with a darker colour that you're going to block them out, and it will feel a bit weird, but as it dries they will shine through. Now this is an excellent example. Under here I didn't let it dry quite enough between layers, and I've done that so that you can see what happens. You can see here that it's starting to blur out of the circle. Whereas over here, it's nice and crisp. And that's because it was dry here and not quite dry here. I'll fix that up in a minute when it dries properly. For my last layer, I'm going to do a nice dark green. And again, I'm just choosing what I want to overlay and going straight over the top. You can do as many overlays as you want and as many colours as you want. And it's quite a fun one when you're first starting out to practice what colours go together, what colour combinations you like. In some cases, what colours don't work very well together. So in amongst the circles that I've put drops of water in to give them lots of texture and that real tie-dyed look, like this one here, I'm going to put a few sort of more flat washed ones in as well where I haven't done that to give a more even colour, just to give the picture a bit more variety. And we're all done. So let's just have a very quick summary of what I did today and what the key points are. First of all, I started off really lightly. I added lots of water to make my paint a really light hue, and then I put them on darker and darker each layer. I also made sure each layer was really, really dry between each application so that the colours didn't muddy together, and I made sure my brushes were really clean between each application of paint. We looked at some different techniques. The first one was wet on dry, which was adding wet paint onto dry paper. We made beautiful circle shapes, and to get the textures, we added drops of water. And then for this more pastel wash, I didn't add the additional drops of water. Thanks so much for watching, everyone. I hope you enjoyed the video. Next time I will be working with wet on wet and making a really cool night sky. Good luck with your watercolour adventures. I hope you give it a go. See you next time.